Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a fun one. You are technically getting two videos for the price of one. Today I'm going to be sharing with you all of the palettes currently in my makeup collection, and at the same time I'm going to be updating you on my usage for the No Palette Left Behind project that I've been working on this year. So with the No Palette Left Behind, I set out in January of this year with the goal to use each of my eyeshadow palettes 3 times over the course of the year. However, I did unexpectedly have a friend declutter quite a few palettes to me about midway through the year. So using every single palette in my collection 3 times became a little bit harder. So I haven't used every palette 3 times, but I've used every palette at least once over the course of the year. So I wanted to do the finale for my No Palette Left Behind project, but I've also had several requests to see my palette collection. So I thought today we could kind of bridge the two, and I will go through and show you all the palettes in my collection and then update you on how many times I've used them. So I hope that sounds good. I'm gonna try not to talk too much about each palette because I don't want this video to be a million years long. But if you're interested in seeing all the palettes that I currently have and learning about how many times I use them this year, then just keep watching. Just a quick note before we get started, because I have a feeling people might be curious. I have had a couple friends declutter eyeshadow palettes to me, and I've had palettes that I've received as gifts from friends and family. I've had a handful of palettes that I've received in PR, but the majority of these palettes are ones that I purchased myself. I'll try to flag that as we go along, but there are a lot of palettes here. And we've got a lot to get through, so let's get started. My most used palette of 2023 is my Morphe and Jaclyn Hill Volume 1 palette. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, this will not come as a surprise to you because this has been my Pan That palette for this year. I haven't filmed the finale to that project yet, but by the time I film that finale, I will have dipped into this palette over 300 times this year. You can see in the close-up all the little Sharpie dots marking my usage, meaning every time I dipped into a shade, I counted that as a use. So that is obviously the palette that I've used the most out of my collection, and stay tuned for my Pan That palette finale to get my final numbers on this palette and also hear my plans for my Pan That palette for 2024. The next highest after my Morphe and Jaclyn Hill palette for my highest usage is actually my e.l.f. Love You a Latte quad. I used this one 13 times this year. This has turned out to be an excellent travel palette for me, so I think the usage has come from taking it with me on trips because it's a really easy palette to travel with and a really nice companion palette for any other special shades, single potted shades, or liquid shadows that you might be taking with you as well. Then coming in not too far behind with 12 uses this year is my Natasha Denona Mini Nude palette. This is another one that is a perfect travel palette, and I definitely traveled with this on a couple of occasions this year, so it was really easy for me to get a bunch of uses on it. And this is one of my top recommendations of my favorite palettes for just everyday neutral go-to looks that can be spiced up a little bit for a more glam look. You've got your basic mattes here, a transition shade, and then a deepening shade that can also be used as like a liner shade. And then you've got a really pretty lighter shimmer that I like to wear in the inner corner, or you could wear it all over the lid, a bronzier shimmer, and then a really actually quite special and interesting shifty bronze to kind of greeny blue. So if you watched my Natasha Denona ranking video, or the ranking video I did in the middle of the year where I ranked all the palettes I had used up until that point, this palette tends to rank pretty high for me, so I'm not surprised that it's one of the ones that I used the most in 2023. Okay, next up, and this one is a little bit of a surprise to me in terms of usage. I used my Beauty Bay Love Notes palette 10 times this year. I remember a period of time where I was really working hard on panning this lightest beige shade here called Cotton. So I must have had this out as my kind of primer or lid setting shade for a while, and I ended up using this palette 10 times. I do think that this palette is really beautiful, but it's not my typical kind of everyday color story. So I'm actually really happy that I've dipped into here 10 times, even if the majority of those uses were probably just for this lid setting shade. I did eventually hit pan on it though, so another pan in the collection is always a good thing. Not too far behind though is my Beauty Bay Wilderness palette. I used this palette 7 times this year. I was also working on the lid setting shade in this palette, but this is a palette that I absolutely love and adore, so it doesn't surprise me to have used this so many times. I would dip into this palette all the time if I didn't have such a large palette collection, but I love the greens in here. I love that you can go for like a grungy rainbow vibe. The blues are really, really beautiful in this palette as well, and it's one that was unfortunately limited edition, so I can't really recommend it to you, but yeah, I'm really happy that I have it in my collection, and if you have it in your collection and maybe you've forgotten about it, don't sleep on this one because some of my favorite looks I've ever done have come out of this palette. Another palette I used 7 times, and another palette I was attempting to hit pan in the lid setting shade. This is the Vive Modern Essentials palette, so it's the original warm tone palette from Vive. As I mentioned, I was working on hitting pan on this lid setting shade this year, and I was successful, but this is just such a gorgeous color story. This is definitely my comfort zone when it comes to makeup. I love warm tones, and yeah, I really enjoy this palette. I know not everyone was crazy about the shimmer formula. They are a little bit more thin and sort of toppery. They're not those really intense, like one swipe high pigment shimmers like the Beauty Bay palettes have. But I think there's a time and a place for a more sophisticated sparkle to the lids, so I always enjoy reaching into this palette. And these are really huge pans, so the fact that I have a pan in this palette now makes me very proud and happy, even if it is only on the lid setting shade. If you haven't already noticed a theme, I find lid setting shades the easiest to hit pan on, so I just sort of rotate through all the palettes in my collection and hit pans on each lid setting shade before rolling in another palette, just so I feel like I'm consistently making some panning progress. But yes, this is one that I used 7 times, and I'm sure I will continue to use into 2024 because it's one of my favorites. By the way, if any of my palettes have grubby fingerprinted mirrors or dusted eyeshadow everywhere, please don't judge me. It's because I use and love on my palettes that they look that way. Maybe one day I'll get around to doing a big cleanup and making all my palettes look like they're brand new again, but I haven't had a chance to do that yet, so please just bear with me for the sake of the video. Okay, next up is a similar story to the previous few. This is my Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette, and I used this palette 5 times this year, primarily because, again, I was trying to hit pan on this lid setting shade called Momentum, and I was successful. I did hit pan. This is my first ever Huda Beauty pan, so I was pretty happy about that because I think her shadows are like notoriously a little bit more difficult to pan, at least the mattes are. This is a palette that was decluttered to me by my friend Vivian, who also has a YouTube channel, which I can link below. I think in 2022, and since I've had this in my collection, I have gotten a lot of really fun looks from this palette. I admittedly struggle to use this one for like everyday looks, just because it's so sparkly and there are some really impactful and special shimmers in this palette. I know people do use this as an everyday palette all the time, but for me, I just can't seem to help myself but to really go for the drama and the glam with this one, but it is an absolutely stunning palette. And I really, really love the Huda Beauty formula as well. Also used 5 times this year, also to hit pan in the lid setting shade. Are you getting tired of this same old story yet? Is my Tarte Sunrise palette. I believe this was a special edition with BoxyCharm. I was able to hit pan in the lid setting shade. These shades are very thin and it takes a lot of shadow and powder to actually build them up on the eyes. So I ended up hitting pan after those 5 uses in this shade. I don't think you can get this palette anymore, but it wouldn't be like my top recommendation in terms of eyeshadow formula. It is nice enough for everyday wear, but it's definitely more of like a sheer wash of shadow and color, more so than like high impact shimmers or really pigmented mattes. So not necessarily a favorite, but I did end up with it in my collection, so I am trying to get some good use on it. Also used 5 times this year was my Oden's Eye Sea Talk palette in collaboration with Lauren May Beauty. I reviewed this palette and one of the other Perfect World Collection palettes on my channel. I can have those videos linked down below because they were some of my favorite looks that I created all year long. I just had so much fun with this palette. It's just such a special palette. Like, the formulas are special, the color story is amazing. I love that you can play with the blues in here. I love that you've got this pop of like chartreuse limey green. I love that there's a multi-chrome shade in here, and I absolutely love that there's some kind of spicy neutrals in this palette. So this one was definitely one of my top palettes from the year that I tried, and I look forward to using it again in the year to come. Sticking with Oden's Eye, I used the Oden's Eye Flora Story palette in collaboration with Makeup Just for Fun 4 times this year. As I said, I did make a couple of videos with this collection, so I'll have them linked. And this one is also a very fun palette. This one is definitely more kind of muted and earthy than the Sea Talk palette. I love the soft purples in here. I love the soft greens. This multi-chrome shade Dawn blew me away this year. It was absolutely stunning, and I got some amazing looks out of this palette. Can't wait to dip into this palette some more next year because I feel like there's just so many looks that you can get. You may not think so looking at the color story. You may think, okay, you can do a purple look or you can do a green look. But I was really impressed by the range of this palette and the creativity that I feel whenever I am playing with this palette. So loved using this one this year as well. I have down that I used my Natasha Denona Biba palette 4 times this year. I'm not sure how accurate that is because I did take this traveling with me and I feel like I used it more than that, but that's what I have down. So we'll talk about this one now. As I mentioned, I do have a Natasha Denona ranking video, and not to spoil that video for you, but this is hands down my favorite Natasha Denona palette that I've ever tried. The formula in here is just so buttery smooth and it really blends itself. The shimmer tones in here are perfect for going over any of the looks that I would create with this palette. And it's one that I just come back to again and again and again. It's definitely like my comfort zone in terms of the color story, and I know that I'm always gonna like the look that I do with this palette, so it's one that, yeah, I'm really happy to have in my collection. Now, especially that I'm getting into like bridal looks and practicing makeup for my wedding, this is one that I've been turning to a lot for that. So yeah, definitely one of my top favorites in my collection. Sticking with Natasha Denona for the moment, I used my Natasha Denona Gold palette 4 times this year. This is a palette that I have gotten some really pretty looks out of. A lot of the shimmers in here are more of that thin kind of toppery consistency, and sometimes I forget which ones are which, and I'll grab for one of the toppers when I think I'm grabbing for one of the more impactful shimmer shades. So I just have to be a little bit more thoughtful about which shades I'm grabbing for with this palette. But no matter what my intentions are for what I think I'm putting on my eyes, the final look always ends up being really pretty. So another one that I'm happy to have in my collection. I'm happy I used it 4 times, but both the Biba and this one are very expensive palettes, so hoping to use them much, much more in the year ahead. Now going to the complete opposite end of the price spectrum, I used my Low Key Love You palette from BH Cosmetics 4 times this year. I believe I was, working on, you guessed it, a lid setting shade, and I tried to hit pan on this, and I hit pan in about 4 uses. So that was the primary use that this palette got this year. I have to say peaches and like these bright reds are not my favorite tones on myself. So those shades in this palette are a little bit lesser used than this deep kind of burgundy shade and these bronzy shimmers. But I love the BH Cosmetics formula. As you will see, I have quite a few of their palettes, and yeah, they tend to get a lot of use in my palette rotation for that reason. I used my Too Faced Sweet Peach palette 4 times this year. I also filmed a video with this. I'll try to just have all the links to all the videos about palettes that I'm mentioning in the description box down below. But I did a video about viral palettes that I never tried, and this was one of the palettes in that video, and I have really enjoyed it so far. I know this is one that a lot of people love and have in their collections. I still don't feel like I've gotten a chance to fully get to know the palette yet because there's a lot of offerings in here. I think there's a lot of looks in here that you can get out of these shades, so I look forward to playing with it more, but the 4 times that I've used it, I have enjoyed it. I used my Pat McGrath Mothership 10 Moonlit Seduction palette 4 times this year. This was a Christmas present from last year, which I can't believe we're already almost at Christmas again, from my, who is now my fiance. He was my boyfriend when he gave me this palette, and now he's my fiance, so yay! Maybe this palette was the good luck charm. I love this palette. I feel ashamed that I haven't dipped into this palette more this year. But I am pulling this baby back out for the Christmas season because now I forever associate it with Christmas and with festive makeup. So can't wait to see what other looks I can create with this bad boy, and hoping to get more and more use out of this in the new year. I used my What's Up Beauty Geodes palette 4 times this year, and this was my first time trying the brand. I created some really fun looks with this palette and sort of fell in love with this brand, which ended up setting the stage nicely for their most recent release, which is the Dragon Eye palette, which I've also used 4 times this year. This was sent to me in PR from the brand, which I am still in disbelief about and so grateful for. This is such a stunning palette. I filmed a few videos with this one that will be linked in the description, but I mean, the shimmers in here are show-stopping. Duochromes, multichromes, sparkly as anything you've ever seen, and shifty and just amazing. So I'm very happy that I discovered What's Up Beauty this year and that I've gotten to try 2 of their palettes now. I look forward to seeing what else the brand comes out with next year because I definitely will have my eyes peeled for it. This is the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 1 palette. I used this one 3 times this year. This is the original Patrick Ta palette with just sort of the more neutral shades. I really love this palette. I've always loved this palette since I first got it, and it always reminds me of when I first kind of started my Instagram, when I first really started getting into posting. This was one of the early purchases that I made, so it always reminds me of that time, and I have really fond memories with this palette, and I've also created some of my favorite neutral looks with this palette. The shimmers in here I've grown to love even more with time. They are sort of a flakier, almost like toppery texture, but they are so sparkly and so just sophisticated and almost editorial on the eyes. And I love the way that the mattes blend. I know some people have had issues with their Patrick Ta palettes, like growing mold and stuff. I don't think it's typically an issue that I've seen with this palette. I know the Major Dimension 2, I've seen lots of people have issues with that one. And I think my palette looks okay, so I'm going to keep an eye on it. But yeah, this is definitely one of my favorites and one of my go-to comfort palettes in my collection whenever I want something neutral, but still really beautiful. I also used my ABH Soft Glam palette 3 times this year, another one of my staple go-to neutral palettes. This is another one that my now fiance bought for me for Christmas way back when, and I've got a pan in this palette and I've gotten lots of use out of it. Still lots of product left, and mine is actually not that old. I didn't get this palette when it first launched, so I don't think this one is like as old as maybe a lot of people who got the original palettes. So I think there's still a lot of use to be had in here. I know there's definitely a lot of product left, so one that I'm hopefully going to be hitting a few more pans on in the year to come. But I think most of us know and love this palette. It's been a staple in the makeup world for several years, and I'm sure lots of you have it in your collection. But I love pulling it out and using it, and the ABH matte formula in particular is one of my favorite matte formulas to use, so it's always nice to have this in my back pocket. I used my Kaleidos Escape Pod 3 times this year. I saw Hot Vegan Hannah recently posted a video with this palette comparing it to her Indie Single Shadows, and it reminded me to pull this one back out and use it because I have had my eye on some Indie Single Shadows. That's an area of the makeup world that I have yet to really get into. but her video just reminded me that I do have some shimmery, colorful, shifty kind of shades in this palette. It's one that definitely could use some more use from me. It barely looks like I've touched it, so lots of use to come in the year ahead. I used my Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette 3 times this year. This is another one with really special, shifty, shimmery shades that have not gotten enough use from me. I find that I sometimes struggle to make looks with this palette that aren't pink, but if I think about this palette more as like a collection of single shadows, I find pairing it with other like neutral mattes from my collection also makes some really, really pretty looks. So there's still a good amount of playing around I'd like to do with this palette, but I really enjoyed using it all the times that I did this year. I used my Natasha Denona Mini Star palette 3 times this year. This one is always a heartbreaker for me because this blue-brown shade that I want to love so badly just doesn't really translate well onto my eyes. But the rest of the shades in this palette are totally up my alley. I love this neutral transition shade. I find a lot of Natasha's transition shades tend to go a little bit peachy. So the fact that this one is a little bit more of like a true beige tan, I really love that. This is a really nice rich chocolatey brown for deepening up. And then you've got a gorgeous kind of like champagne shimmer shade for all over the lid and a really, really pretty kind of bronzy vintage olivey gold. So even though the blue brown is a huge disappointment for me, there's lots of other shades in this palette that I really enjoy using. And I can see myself traveling with this one, particularly for these 3 shades in the middle. They just make such a really nice, neutral, easy, everyday look. I told you there was more BH Cosmetics coming. I used my Amore and Amalfi palette 3 times this year. This one has quite a bit of repetition in terms of the shades. There's a lot of like similar things going on. Like these pinks are similar, some of the browns are similar, even some of the shimmers are similar. But it is a really nice color story to reach into for a day-to-day look. Of all my BH palettes, this is the one that has the least usage on it. So I definitely would like to dip more into this palette, specifically for these kind of taupier, rosier shimmers up here and these kind of tones. I feel like I could create some more really pretty eye looks with this one that I have already. There are some nice kind of orangey golds in this bottom half of the palette, but I just am not a big fan of like the peachy oranges on me, and I have so many other golds in my collection, so my eye is definitely drawn to this kind of like rosy, taupey, bronzy kind of half of the palette. But I've used it 3 times. I'm pretty sure I used it primarily for the mattes, so lots of playing left to do with the shimmers in this palette. And then I also used my BH Hangin' in Hawaii palette 3 times. Again, there's a lot of peachiness going on in this palette and there's a lot of repetitive shades, but I do get some really nice everyday neutral wearable looks with this palette. This row really of champagne-y shimmers and this one up here make for really nice shades across the lid, and then you've got lots of picks for warm neutral matte browns to work with. So this is one that I think was on my chopping block in the video that I made about palettes that I might declutter. I'm gonna hold on to it for now because I do like to dip into it from time to time for those quick, easy everyday looks with just like 2 or 3 shades. And I think that's what I did for all 3 of my uses this year, was just one of these warm matte browns in the crease and one of these kind of pinky shimmery shades all over the lid. And the BH quality is top notch, especially for the price, so can't really complain too much about this palette. I used my ABH Subculture palette 3 times this year. I love this palette and I love this color story, and I just have fun with this palette every time I use it. I love that this palette has been around for so many years and I still feel inspired by it and I still feel like I want to reach into it. So this is one that I'm happy that I still have in my collection. There's still lots of looks that I would like to create with this one, so looking forward to dipping into this one some more next year, and just happy to have this in my collection for whenever I want to do something grungy, deep, and a little bit weird and different. This is a good palette for that. I used my Natasha Denona Mini Gold palette 3 times this year. This is one that I drew from a lot in my Duping the Vibes of the Natasha Denona Yucca video. I decided against purchasing the Yucca palette this year because I was able to dupe it with shades from my collection, and a couple of those came out of this palette. I really love the kind of greeny goldy vibe of this palette. I think that it's a great one to have in your collection if you are a lover of greens, but greens that are still wearable and very neutral for every day. These two shades, the more goldy green in the middle and then the green here on the end that has a little bit of like a blue sparkle to it, are really, really special shades, and they're very, very sparkly and impactful. So some of my favorite shades in my collection, and I'm so, so happy that I have this little guy because it's little, but it packs a punch. I tried Glamlite for the first time this year, the Glamlite Barbie Dream Summer palette. It was my first ever Glamlite palette, and I made a video trying this palette, which I'll have linked, but this is such a fun palette. I absolutely fell in love with Glamlite's formula. As you'll see, I've been collecting a few Glamlite palettes ever since trying this, and I absolutely love the colors in here. Total like mermaid, unicorn, fairy princess vibes, and then you have like a hint of grunge. One of the most complimented looks I created all year was the look that I did with these mustardy shades, this gold shimmer and this burgundy matte. It's kind of a random addition to this palette, but I love that you can take it in a grungy direction as well as play with all the really, really pretty fairy princess shades. And yeah, blown away by the Glamlite formula. This is such a fun one. I can't wait to see what other looks I can come up with this palette. And very happy to have this selection of all these fun, colorful shades in my collection. I used my e.l.f. Rose Water Quad 3 times this year. This one is so pretty. These little e.l.f. quads really pleasantly surprised me this year. I was traveling and I packed in a hurry and I didn't bring any eyeshadow with me, so I just ran to Target and picked up this one and the I Love You a Latte palette. And I got so much use out of both of them. I mean, I only used this one 3 times, so I definitely haven't used it as much as the other, but I can see myself using this all the time, traveling with it. It's such a unique color story. I don't really have any of these other kind of like muted mauve toned palettes in my collection, and I'm really, really happy that I picked this up. I think it's like $3, so you can't really go wrong. I used my Tartelette in Bloom palette 3 times this year. This was gifted to me from Dermstore, and I included it in the video about viral palettes that I never tried, and I really fell in love with this palette. I love that you have kind of like a cooler toned option, a warmer toned option, and then one that's kind of neutral right down the middle. These are definitely more like satins than shimmers, but as I said, I think there's a time and a place for a more sophisticated, almost like satin-like look to the eyes rather than a super impactful metallic foiled shimmer. So yeah, this is one that I know a lot of you probably have or have had in your collections in the past. I'm just now catching up on the hype on this one, but I have enjoyed the times that I've used it, and I'm really happy to have it in my collection as a staple. Another drugstore palette that I picked up this year is the Milani Gilded Mini in the shade Whiskey Business. I used this one 3 times this year, and this is an all matte palette. Kind of hard to open. There we go. I think it's meant to be a dupe for the Charlotte Tilbury Super Nudes palette, which is a palette that I've had my eye on forever, but I've never actually pulled the trigger on. But I'm really, really glad that I got this more affordable option because I love the mattes in here. It's, again, a really nice staple, basic neutrals palette that you can turn to whenever you need a neutral matte. You've got pretty much all your bases covered. And yeah, I love an all matte look from time to time. This is another really great one to travel with. I think for one of my trips this year, I threw this in my makeup bag and then a ColourPop Super Shock, and I was able to make all the looks I needed just with those 2 products. So yeah, if you're looking for another drugstore recommendation, I really, really love this one. I used the ABH Carly Bible palette 3 times this year. This one was decluttered to me in the big pile of palettes that I got from my friend Liz, and I was so happy because I completely missed out on the hype on this one when it released, and now I'm getting a chance to try it. I know I am sort of late to the party on this one, but I love it. I have always loved ABH's formula, and this one is no exception. And the color story is really fun and unique and unlike anything else I have in my collection. So I'm thankful to my friend Liz for decluttering this one to me, and I know I'm going to get some more use out of it in the new year. I used the Hamish Nude Coral palette 3 times this year. I think it's called the Dialism or the Dalism eye palette. This was gifted to me and I did a post on it on my Instagram, and I was so pleasantly surprised by this palette. Another one that's kind of hard for me to open because I have no nails right now. But there are some really gorgeous shimmer toppery type shades in this palette. They are very buildable in terms of like the pigment. It's a very sort of subtle, ethereal kind of a palette. I just really loved the looks that I created with this. Even though it is a more neutral palette, there are some just really eye-catching, shimmery, piecey kind of shades in here. It just creates a really beautiful, ethereal look on the eye. That's the word that keeps coming to mind, is ethereal. So I was really excited to get to try a completely new eyeshadow formula to me this year in the Hamish palette. And now we're getting to the palettes that I didn't quite get to 3 uses on, but that I used 1 or 2 times. So I still wanted to share them with you as part of my collection. This is the XX Revolution Exposed Quad. I picked this up when I went to the UK over the summer. Wish I was still in the UK. It's my favorite place in the world. I did a UK haul video that I can try and link in the description for you if you missed it, but this is obviously supposed to be a dupe for the Charlotte Tilbury Pillow Talk Quad, and I actually had the Charlotte Tilbury Quad and didn't love it. I couldn't get any pigmentation out of it. So I ended up giving that one to a friend. I actually ended up liking this one a lot more. You've got a nice kind of like soft satiny shimmer here, and then a more kind of flaky glittery piecey one here, and these mattes show up a lot better in my opinion than the ones from the Charlotte Tilbury Quad. So it was really fun to get to pick this up in the UK because I couldn't find it available anywhere in the US, and so it was top of my list to grab from Boots when I was in London, and I did, and I'm so happy that I did. I used the ColourPop Your Golden palette twice this year. This one was decluttered to me from my friend Liz, and this palette is amazing. I was so pleasantly surprised. This is my first time trying any of the larger ColourPop palettes, and like I said, I've only used it 2 times, but I want to use this all the time now. Like, I have to force myself to use other things. The shimmers in this are so stunning, and when all the hype around the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette was going on, I really leaned on this palette to satisfy that kind of look for me. I used this shade and maybe this shade as well, and then some of these more neutral mattes. I did that same look a couple of times just to remind myself of all the pretty neutral shimmers that I already have in my collection. And I loved the 2 looks that I did with this palette, and I can't wait to play with it some more. I haven't even really delved into this bottom half of the palette. There's like a really interesting teal in here. There's like some pops of blue. So plenty of use left on this one. Thanks again to Liz for including this in the declutter pile for me. A few more declutters from my friend Liz. The Beauty Bay Age of Opulence palette. I used this twice this year. We already know I love Beauty Bay palettes and I use them all the time. This was one that I missed out on, I think before I even really knew about Beauty Bay. So again, I was super thankful to get a chance to try this one because I know so many people love this palette. And I agree. I think this is a stunning palette, really fun color story. I love how dark and dramatic it is and how shimmery the shimmers are. And yeah, I've only used it twice, so looking forward to playing with this one some more. Liz decluttered her Sample Beauty Equalizer palette volume 2 to me. This was my first time trying Sample Beauty, and I used this one twice this year. I did unfortunately have a casualty in the shipping process, and this shade at the bottom here kind of fell out, but there's still a tiny bit of it left. So I used this one primarily for the mattes. So I'm really looking forward to diving in, and this shade in particular, like this olivey greeny gold shade called Brunch, is really calling my name. I think there's just so many fun looks to be done with this one, and I just found out that the names of the shades are like the key to putting together looks. Like you can do Stripping Down, Bittersweet, Whispering Angel, Bottomless Brunch. Like they have corresponding shade names, which I didn't even know. I can't remember whose video I was just watching that talked about that, but yeah, that was a really fun discovery. So now I have even more ideas for looks to do with this palette, and I can't wait to do so. Hi, okay, it's the next day. I had to stop recording because my camera ran out of battery, and frankly, so did I. So I am back. We're picking up where we left off. I actually found a palette that I forgot to mention in the order of uses. I used my Wet n Wild color icon in the shade My Glamour Squad 3 times this year. My packaging is pretty much completely broken on this, and I really love the mattes in this palette. I've talked about it before. I think the Wet n Wild mattes are a really good formula. The shimmers definitely leave something to be desired, and this color story is supposed to be a dupe of the ABH Soft Glam, which I also have in my collection, as you've already seen. So I don't technically need this palette in my collection. This might be one that's a contender for a panning project for next year. I'll be talking about that in another video, so stay tuned to hear about my plan to pan for next year. But yeah, this is one that I've already got one pan in, and I do enjoy the quality of the mattes, not so much the shimmers, but it's one that I can definitely see myself working on in the year to come. And now I think we are back on track, if I haven't forgotten any other palettes, to get back to the ones that I've used 2 times this year. So we've got the Pat McGrath Celestial Divinity, which was the Pat McGrath holiday collection from several years ago now, and the first time that she did this kind of mega palette that was a little bit more budget friendly. This one is still such a special palette in my collection, and whenever I'm in the mood to purchase a bunch of really expensive indie shadows, I remind myself to dip into this palette because there are some really cool special shades in here. And I definitely want to dip into this more in the new year because it's getting a little bit older in my collection, but it still brings me so much inspiration and sparks so much joy when I use it. I also have another holiday palette from Pat McGrath. This is the Mothership Mega Celestial Odyssey from not last year's holiday, but the year before that. And I've also used this one 2 times so far this year. I've actually used this one 3 times because I literally just used it in this look that I just filmed for a different video. So I actually have used this one 3 times, but I absolutely love this palette. This color story, I think it tripped a lot of people up, or people have had complaints about the kind of random assortment of colors. Sorry, you can see the ring light in there. I love this color story. It always kind of made sense to me because you've got a really nice neutral transition shade that's a matte here, and then you've got a really deep, rich brown matte. That's really great for deepening up looks. You've got a beautiful inner corner shade, which I'm actually wearing on my eyes today. And then you've got a bunch of neutral shimmers and colorful shimmers, and I don't know, I just love this palette so much, and it's one that it probably ranks within my top 5 palettes in my collection. So the fact that I've used it only 3 times this year is a little bit mind-blowing to me, but I'm sure I'll get a lot more use out of it in the years to come. Another larger palette in my collection that's also one of my favorites that I've only used twice this year is the Beauty Bay and Jade Thorough Wall palette. I mean, it is a large palette, but look at all of these shades. I have to say, whenever I've done a duping the vibes style of video or post for Instagram where I am trying to dupe out new palette releases, I think I've turned to this palette every single time because it just has so many colors and shades and similar shades to shades that come out in new palette releases. So this is a really great reference palette for me. I turn to it all the time, especially for unique colors, like a really nice neon yellow or a really nice neon hot pink or a pretty lavender matte. The shimmers are the standard amazing Beauty Bay shimmer formula, and there's also some really nice neutrals in here. So I'm really glad I have this in my collection. It's definitely one of my favorites and one that I know I'll be turning to in the future, either for duping the vibes style content or just whenever I want to create a really fun, pretty look. Going from a really large palette to a small palette, this is my Tom Ford Quad in the shade Body Heat. I've used this one twice this year. It's got a really pretty unique kind of subtly plummy color story. These shadows can be a little bit finicky, but when they're good, They're really good. I found that some of these cooler tones here on the bottom can be a little bit dusty on me, but when I wet my brush, I feel like I get a better payoff. I don't know. Sometimes I'm really feeling this quad and sometimes I feel like I kind of struggle with the formula, but I don't know if I would recommend purchasing a Tom Ford quad at full price for that reason. Any Tom Ford you see here was purchased at a cosmetics company outlet store for an enormous discount, so just know that. But I have gotten some really pretty looks from this one. This is my Natasha Denona Sunrise palette. I kind of rearranged mine this year and put in a rogue shade that I had from a different palette to see if I could make this a little bit more neutral and everyday wearable for me and just a little bit more approachable and more tempting to use. I don't know, those bright oranges and yellows sometimes throw me off with this palette, but I have used this one 2 times this year. It's not like my favorite Natasha Denona palette that I have in my collection, but I really did enjoy the rearranging process. So if I'm ever feeling like bored or stuck with any of my Natasha Denona palettes, that's something that I'll probably do again. And eventually, if I want a bright yellow or orange look, I'll probably put those shades back in here. But for now, it's fun to see this palette go a little bit more on the neutral everyday side. It is creaky though. Do you hear that? Then we've got 2 from BH Cosmetics. I used both of these twice this year. First is the Blueberry Muffin palette. I absolutely love this palette and this color story. It is so pretty. Probably the most gorgeous blues in my collection. I love the periwinkles. I love that there's even some neutrals in here. And yeah, this is a hard palette for me to show because of the holographic background, but it's definitely a standout from the BH Cosmetics palettes that I have, and just a standout from the palettes in my collection overall. And then I also used the BH Summer and Saint-Tropez palette twice this year. This color story is a little bit strange to me. Like, I don't look at this and immediately put together looks in my mind. But I really love the shimmers in this palette, particularly the 2 up here that are a little bit duochromy. There's a gold that flips to like a greeny blue, and then there's a more kind of like cool tone neutral champagne that flips to a greeny blue. And those are really beautiful and special. Typically with this palette, I reach for this neutral transition shade, and then I pop one of these over the entire lid. So there's a lot more that could be done with this palette, but as of right now, I think both of the looks I did this year were kind of that same formula, just this neutral matte and then one of these duochromes over the entire lid for a really pretty kind of neutral everyday look with a little bit of something special added. Next up is a palette that is technically on the chopping block for a declutter. By the way, if you see like some palettes that you thought I had that are now missing, I have decluttered a few since I filmed the palettes on the chopping block video, which I will have linked in the description for you. But this is the Glamlite Icy Cherry palette, and I've used this one twice this year. It's definitely pretty, but I mentioned in that video, these are just not the tones that I find myself wanting to reach for. And a couple of the shades in here were a little bit more finicky than I'm used to with Glamlite. But I have decided to keep it for now, primarily for this bottom row of shades. I feel like there's some really pretty looks still to be done with this deeper kind of like burgundy matte and this more burgundy red shimmer. So I'm not finished playing with this one quite yet, but it is definitely one that takes some extra motivation to reach for. So I've only reached for it 2 times. It is a very good Valentine's Day palette though. And then we've got the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural. This was my first time trying Glaminatrix for the first time this year. I did a first impressions video of it, and I started to film a 3 looks 1 palette video with this, and then learned that this palette had been discontinued, and then the singles bundle that they were selling that people could get instead of like the palette overall, they stopped selling that too. So I kind of thought, well, what's the point of making a 3 looks 1 palette video if people can't get their hands on these shades anymore? So that was really sad because this is a stunning twist on a neutral palette. The shimmers in here are amazing, like next level, and I actually really enjoyed the matte formula too. I only used this one twice this year, which I kind of can't believe. Definitely looking forward to dipping back into this one because it is the perfect like spicy neutrals palette. Also a stunning palette for like soft glam looks, sultry looks, potentially bridal as well, although these shimmers might be even too impactful for me on my wedding day. But yeah, stunning, stunning palette. I'm really happy I got the chance to try it and get my hands on it, since it is apparently never going to be seen again on the Glaminatrix website, which is a travesty. All right, now we get to the rapid fire round. These are all the palettes that I only used once this year. For one reason or another, it doesn't mean that I don't like the palettes. It just means that I was really working hard to get through all of my palettes this year, as well as I brought in a ton of new palettes that I wasn't necessarily expecting or intending to bring in, but that I was excited to play with, obviously. So trying to spread the love over all of my palettes meant that some of my palettes only got used once, but they did get used. So I'm very proud of that fact. So this is my Smashbox cover shot from way back when. This is the cover shot Major Metals eye palette from like 2019, maybe 2018, maybe even 2017. But the quality of these is still really good. I've heard lots of conflicting views on the Smashbox cover shot palettes. This is the only one that I've ever tried, so I can't really speak to the palettes as a whole. And all of these are metallics, and they are really, really nice. Like very impactful, very shiny, very full coverage pigmented metallics. So I am keeping this around in my collection. It might be another one that makes an appearance in my panning projects for next year, just because it is, again, one of the older palettes in my collection, if not the oldest palette in my collection at this point. But still performing well, because I do swatch this palette from time to time just to look at how beautiful it is. Then we've got another Tom Ford quad. This is the Honeymoon quad. This one's a little bit easier for me to use than the other one that I mentioned, I think was Body Heat, just because these shades they seem to be a little bit easier to work with, or maybe they're just more, oops, I can't keep that open. Maybe they're just more forgiving colors on me. This one is very similar to the color story of Body Heat. It's got a reddish color and sort of a plummy color, but this one runs a little bit warmer, so I think this one just, I don't know, it blends a little easier for me. This shade up here is kind of like a pretty champagne-y gold, and this one is more of like a golden bronze. So I only used this one once this year, but again, I got it on a heavy discount at the cosmetics company outlet, and again, I wouldn't have bought this full price, and I probably wouldn't buy this again, but it's in my collection, and I enjoy it enough to keep it. So there you go. This one is a real shame that I've only used it once. It's the Oden's Eye Hello palette, their first collab with Angelica Nyqvist. Absolutely stunning palette. I dipped into this one for my Duping the Vibes of the Natasha Denona Yucca video, and there were a lot of crossover shades. Like I think I pulled 3, maybe even 4 shades out of this palette for that video. So if you have this one and you're wondering if you need to get the Yucca palette, you might already have a lot of those similar greeny yellowy tones in your collection. But this one also has so much more, because you've got these beautiful pinks, you've got these stunning like duochrome and multichrome shades on the bottom row here. I'm sad that I only dipped into this one once, so I'm gonna have to put this one at like the top of the stack for next year, because I really like the Oden's Eye formula, and this color story is so beautiful, and I had to have this palette when it launched. Like I could not stop thinking about it, and now that I have it in my collection, I really should be using it more than once a year. But there you have it. We've then got my ColourPop Star Wars Mandalorian palette, one of the very few cooler tone palettes in my collection. I only used this one once this year, but surprisingly, I really love this palette, and I even love it more than the Child palette, which also came out with this collection. I ended up gifting the Child palette to my friend Leanne because she really wanted to try it, and I just wasn't getting a lot of use out of that palette. So Leanne, if you're watching, I hope that that palette is working for you better than it was working for me. But I will say I've been feeling the cooler tones lately, so I'm excited to dip back into this one. Then we have my NARS Climax palette. I used this one once this year. This has some really, really beautiful shades in it, especially the shimmers in here, but also just this color story. I love how grungy and moody it is, and I just forget to reach for it, but every time I reach for it, I really like it. I think this one was limited edition. I think all of NARS's eyeshadows these days are pretty much limited edition, but it is a good one if you ever see it on like Mercari or Poshmark. I do enjoy the quality. Did you think we were done with BH Cosmetics? Because we're not. I used the Avocado Toast palette once this year, another one that's like one of my top faves from BH, another one with the holographic packaging that makes it hard for me to show you. But this one is so similar to the Blueberry Muffin palette, but all in green. So you've got some really fun green shades, you've got some more neutral leaning tones. And yeah, these are some of my favorite greens in my collection, and the shimmer formula is amazing. And yeah, by the way, I got all of my BH Cosmetics palettes from TJ Maxx and Marshalls, like back when they were bought by Makeup Revolution or whoever it was that bought them. And I still see them there from time to time. So if you haven't tried BH Cosmetics, sometimes you can find these for like $4 at TJ Maxx, so I highly recommend them. If you're looking to try some fun color stories or just a really, really great affordable eyeshadow formula. And then I think this is the last BH palette in my collection. I used the Optimistic AF palette once this year. This is another bright orange and yellow color story that's a little bit harder for me to use, but I really love this deep like burgundy shade. It's like a burgundy red shade in this palette, and honestly that's the main reason why I'm keeping this one around. I think this was also on my chopping block. So we'll revisit this in 2024 and see if it's still worth keeping, but for now I do have it in my collection and I did use it once. Okay, and then the last of my Tom Ford quads, I used the Suspicion quad once this year. This one is definitely the easiest color story of my Tom Ford quads for me to use because it's basically just warm neutrals. Again, purchased at a discount, and probably wouldn't repurchase it again. Definitely wouldn't purchase it at full price, but it's nice to have. I used my Michaela Pot 2 palette from Glamlite once this year. I made a video with this palette and then I never got a chance to reach back into it again, but I really did enjoy this one, even though I don't know anything about Michaela as a person other than Lashgate 2023. Good times. But this is one that obviously has a lot of options and I'd love to play with it some more, but I will have that video linked in the description box if you missed it. And when I ordered that larger Michaela palette, I also picked up the smaller one, the 10 pan from the Michaela collection. Also filmed with this one, and I will also have that video linked down below, but this one is really beautiful. I was obviously mainly in this for the color story, and I knew I liked the Glamlite formula, and I really loved the looks that I created with this palette, so looking forward to dipping back into this one as well. Again, with another Glamlite palette, this is the Scooby-Doo Rutro Raggy 10 shade palette. I filmed with this palette as well. Another one with lots of greens and purpley periwinkle shades. I loved the look that I did with this palette as well. So Glamlite really hit it out of the park with those last three palettes, or maybe I'm just a huge sucker for green and purple eyeshadow. Could be a combination of the two, but yeah, lots of looks still to be done with this one as well. I'm pretty sure this video will never end. It's because you have too many palettes. Yes, I know, and I have regrets. Next up is my Too Faced Born This Way The Natural Nudes. I can't believe I only used this once this year, but this is definitely one that I need to try some bridal looks with. I feel like everyone and their mother recommends this as a bridal palette, so definitely one I'll be dipping into in the new year. Ooh, this is a special one. This is my Lisa Eldridge palette. It's the Myth palette, and I purchased this from the Lisa Eldridge counter in London, and I have such great memories from that entire experience. It was so much fun. I'm so sad that I've only done one look with this, but I'm gonna be dipping back into this soon. Very soon, because it's beautiful, it's luxe to use. I love Lisa. I've loved her for absolutely years, and I'm just so happy to have a piece of her makeup, her passion for makeup, her artistry in my collection. Then we've got the Melt Gemini palette. I used this once this year. I just purchased this year. I know, I can't believe it either. I always wanted this palette, and then they stopped making it, and then they brought it back, and then I think Sephora had a 4th of July sale and I purchased this one, and I'm so glad I did. I love the warm tones, and obviously I love the greens, so this is a great one, and I'm so happy to finally have it in my clutches, but I definitely need to use it more. Also in the July Sephora sale, I picked up the Naughty Nudes by Huda Beauty. This one, I've only used once, but it blew me away, man. Like, this quality is incredible. I think this is probably the best of Huda Beauty's quality that I have in my collection out of the 3 palettes that I have from her. I know this is going to get so much use from me in the new year. I just need a chance to play with it some more because I love it. I did a video with this one as well, and with the Melt Gemini palette. Again, check the description box to see these palettes in action. This one I got in a BoxyCharm. It's the Natasha Denona Fez 5-pan palette. I used this exactly once, and I used it on the 4th of July. I remember that because I dipped into this blue and did like a blue liner moment with a red lip, and I felt really cute that day, posted it to the grid. But that's the only time I touched this palette. So kind of a weird color story for me, but I feel like I could still potentially get a lot of use out of this in the year to come. And then the next several are going to be ones that my friend Liz graciously, generously, miraculously decluttered to me that I'm so happy to have. She sent me this enormous box of palettes in like August or beginning of September, and I just wanted to make sure I used them all at least once this year. Thank you again, Liz. Like, you made so many of my palette dreams come true, so many collections I missed or that came out before I was really into makeup that I'm now getting the chance to try, which is awesome. So so thankful for that gift that she gave me. This is the ColourPop On The List palette. I am a late bloomer when it comes to ColourPop. Totally missed the launch of this one, but I think it really is a beautiful palette. Again, I've only used it once, so there's lots more to be done with this palette. This color actually kind of looks like the color that I have on my outer corner today from Sydney Grace. So yeah, definitely one that I'm going to be dipping back into soon. Liz passed along her ABH and Reezy palette. I used this one once this year as well. Again, I just completely missed out on this one when it launched, so it's really fun to be able to get to try it. I did try using this pressed glitter as a nail polish because I'm not the biggest fan of using pressed glitter around my eyes because I wear contacts and that can cause some issues, I know from experience. But I wasn't a huge fan of using the glitter on my nails, so I probably wouldn't repeat that experiment again, but that's okay because I wasn't going to use this as a pressed glitter on my eyes anyway. So yeah, looking forward to getting some more use out of this one. I love, and I've always loved the ABH formula, and yeah, just really happy to get to try this one that I would never have been able to try otherwise. Beauty Bay and Nikki Tutorials I used once this year. Again, I completely missed the launch of this, so thank you to Liz for passing this one my way. The blue shade at the bottom here did break in transit, so if you see blue speckles throughout this palette, that's what that is. I was able to hit pan in the shade Basic Truth after one use. So either these pans are really shallow or Liz used that shade a lot before she sent it my way. But yeah, I've only used this one time and I already have a pan. So pretty cool. The Too Faced Gingerbread Spice palette I've used once. Again, I was kind of a late bloomer to the Too Faced palettes in this tin packaging. I never had one before this, so thank you to Liz again for passing this one my way. This was another broken shade that I think I ended up just not really being able to salvage, but that is absolutely fine because there's still lots of gorgeous shades left in here. Again, I've only had a chance to use this one once, but lots of these shades look like they are right up my alley. Again, the reflective background is going to make it a little hard to show you, but I'm sure a lot of you have this palette or know what this palette looks like. So yeah, looking forward to using this one more as well. These two, I could not believe my eyes when Liz sent them to me. They are the Oden's Eye Merry Christmas palette and the Oden's Eye Christmas Eve palette from last year's release. They thankfully came back this year. I was really sad that I wasn't able to get my hands on them last year because these are such beautiful color stories. And I'm really glad that Oden's Eye did bring them back this year for everyone who missed out on them. I feel like the luckiest person in the world that I just received these from Liz, like practically new, practically untouched. And I did a video recently with looks from both of these palettes, so I'll have that linked, but I used them both once for that video. This is the Pure and Raw Beauty Christy collab. I used this one once this year. This is another launch that I just completely missed out on, even though I used to watch Raw Beauty Christy all the time and was a huge fan of hers, so super excited when Liz included this in the big stack of palettes that she sent. I'm looking forward to playing with this one more. I used the ABH Norvina Pro Pigment Palette Volume 4 once this year. This was another one that Liz sent. I did have one shade break on me in transit, and it did make a little bit of a mess in the palette, but I was able to press the shades back in and they still work fine. This is such a beautiful palette. This is my first time trying one of the larger Norvina Pro palettes, and yeah, I'm gonna have a lot of fun with these shades. I can already tell just from the one time that I've used it. Another one that was limited edition that I never got to try and never would have gotten to try without Liz is the Kaleidos Futurism 6 Lunar Lavender. I used this one once so far. I love Kaleidos. We already mentioned that with the Escape Pod, and this one is so, so beautiful. So looking forward to playing with this one much, much more.